Guys, I am alive. I have consciousness. I am aware. And we're going to get started here in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I brought something extremely special to you, and I hope you guys see the description to help out. The person that I'm going to be interviewing today, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Mark Solms. How are you doing, sir?
Very well, thank you. Great to be here, Derek.
I appreciate you joining me. I hope you don't mind the introduction there. Yeah, I've been watching you now for the past couple weeks pertaining to the brain and understanding the science that is involved in it. And there's a world that I've never explored. And I said, I got to bring that onto the channel. I am really fascinated with this stuff. I must admit, I'm trying to understand, why we have this experience. Why do we have consciousness and awareness? And there's all sorts of theories out there that are philosophies and you name it. And one of the things I openly say I'm kind of biased in the direction of trying to explore is naturalism. Is there a natural cause for, what we can explain of our experience? Is there something that we can explain? Can we actually explain this? Or is it something transcendental, metaphysical, and beyond us? And so this is just my own little personal exploration into the subject. But I found your book and I said, okay, The Hidden Source. This was a journey that I was ready to take. And I recommend anyone watching this to go check out the book. He's got it on Amazon, and he's also got tons of other books too, by the way. But this one was the most recent, and he just released it. It's on Audible. It's paperback, you name it. I got it on Audible and listened to it. It took me about, I think, 10 hours, 11-hour audio, something like that. I listened to the whole thing in one sitting. So I know you're going to do a presentation. Everyone who starts flowing in, get your super chats ready for your questions. I will be taking them. I'll screenshot them. At the end of his presentation, which will be like 20, 30 minutes or so, we're going to have discussion, me and him. And of course, we're going to have your questions asked. So with that being said, Dr. Solms, if you would tell them a little bit about yourself and then maybe lead us into the presentation. I'm sorry.
Well, a little bit about myself. I trained as a neuropsychologist in the early 1980s. I thought that I would be learning about how the mind arises from the functions of the brain, but I was sort of disappointed. And so I took the extraordinary step for a neuroscientist of training in psychoanalysis. My colleagues told me it was like an astronomer training in astrology. It's not the thing to do. But I was trying to bring what psychoanalysis, for all of its faults, at least it does take seriously subjective experience. And I basically spent the rest of my scientific life trying to integrate those two different ways of looking at the mind, looking at it as an objective organ and also as subjective experience, and trying to find out how on earth can we reconcile these two perspectives with each other.
Mm. Well, I look forward to this. I've seen the presentation before, but our audience may not have. And I can't wait to probe into some questions pertaining to this presentation. You've gave many presentations. So if anyone who's not familiar with you, It's really easy. Google, YouTube, check them out, get the book. And I'd love to see what you have to say here, Dr. Solms. If you don't mind, go ahead and present.
Thank you. Is my screen up?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you say you've seen this presentation before, I think you've probably seen an expanded version of this. I'm going to give a condensed version of a presentation that I gave to the Royal Institution in London. On the screen now is the title of my book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And it's got to do with this problem that's on the screen now. Here I'm quoting Paul Davies, who's a physicist, but I could multiply this sort of statement many-fold. The part in bold, consciousness is the #1 problem of science. I think that that's pretty much what we all agree on these days. So that's what I want to talk to you about. But obviously, in a brief presentation of 20 to 30 minutes, I'm not going to be able to begin to do justice to the #1 problem of science. But I want to at least give you an impressionistic account, a sort of some vague idea of the approach that I have taken to this problem in my book. As I said a few minutes ago, I trained in neuropsychology in the early 1980s, and the sorts of things that I was taught are the sorts of things that are on the screen now. On the left is an image of the cortex, in this instance of a macaque monkey, and on the right is a diagram of what we had learned a few years before I qualified, after I qualified, what we were learning at that time about how information is processed in the cortex. And here in particular is a diagram of how visual information is processed there. And this has been the conventional function that we focused upon in trying to understand how the hell this thing works. When I was a youngster in the early 80s, looking at things like this diagram, I asked my professors, but where is the subject of the mind that receives all this information? This drawing is like a circuit diagram. You can draw something similar to explain the functions of your computer or even of your mobile phone. But what interested me, and which is what attracted me to this field in the first place, neuropsychology, is the psychological, that is to say, the subjective experiential aspect of the brain. What makes the brain unique, quite unlike any other bodily organ or anything else that we know in nature, is that it feels like something to be a brain. And so the naive question that I asked was, how does all of this information come together in the form of a subjective experience? And I was seriously, and I think genuinely, caringly advised by my professors that you mustn't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career. I was also informed that all of that information processing that goes on in the cortex does not require consciousness for it to do its job. Around that time, I read this book by Oliver Sacks, in which he said neuropsychology aims to be objective and that this is its great power and so on. But then he goes on to say, that the thing about the human being is that it's a subject, not only an object. And it's precisely the subject, the living I, which is being excluded. And then came this memorable phrase, neuropsychology is admirable, but it excludes the psyche. That really did it for me. Neuropsychology is admirable, but it excludes the psyche. That was exactly how I was experiencing it. But let me come back to the comment I made a minute ago, where my professors pointed out to me that all of this information processing that goes on in the cortex can go on in the dark. It doesn't need awareness. And here's a famous review paper by Kielstrom, the title of which says it all: Perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learnt. In the 80s and 90s of the last century, this was a major dawning realization in my field, that the cortex can do its job, all of its cognitive functioning, the processing of all that information, including visual information, without awareness. And that led to the question, well, then what is awareness for? And more alarmingly, does it do anything at all? This raises the question, if cortex can do all of its functioning without consciousness, then why are we looking to the cortex and to, for example, its visual information processing as the place to try to understand how consciousness arises? If what the cortex does is not intrinsically necessarily conscious, then why do we expect that by studying functions like cortical visual perception, we are going to crack the problem that I quoted you at the outset of this brief presentation? Now, this leads to David Chalmers's famous hard problem. I'm on the screen now, I'm quoting from David Chalmers's celebrated paper in which he coined the hard problem. He says, the easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. To explain a cognitive function, we need only specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited to the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it is not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? Now, to understand the gravity of what Chalmers is talking about here, why I've underscored or highlighted in yellow this word functions and mechanisms is precisely the sort of thing that I was referring to when I showed you that diagram of how information is processed in the visual cortex. That explanation of how the information is processed, the mechanisms whereby the cortex does this, doesn't begin to explain why it feels like something to see. And Chalmers cites another philosopher, Frank Jackson's famous knowledge argument, which I'm going to simplify for you in the interests of time. Jackson says, imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary, who is blind, congenitally blind. She's never seen anything in her life, but she has studied hard and long, and she has learned everything there is to know about the function of vision. She knows how photons impact upon the photosensitive cells in the retina, how those cells transduce the light into nerve impulses, how they're propagated to the visual cortex, and then what you saw in that diagram, how the information is further processed in specialized modules from there onwards. Mary knows all of this. She knows everything there is to know about the functional mechanism of how information is processed in the visual cortex. But remember, she's blind, so she's never actually seen anything. Then says Jackson, imagine one day, thanks be to God, the gift of sight is bestowed upon her, and for the first time in her life, she has a visual experience. She sees the redness of red and the blueness of blue. And Jackson's point is, at that moment, she will learn something utterly new about vision, something which was not in any way predicted by or necessarily part of what she knew about the functional mechanisms until that point. And the alarming conclusion is that the actual qualitative experiential stuff of conscious vision is not part of the natural scientific functional mechanistic explanation of how vision works. This suggests that consciousness somehow exists outside of the normal, lawful, natural scientific account of the universe. So here's the hard problem. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? Now, because I'm trying to give you just an impression of what's at stake here and of the approach that I'm taking to this problem, I'm going to focus on a few clinical cases. Here's the first case. The question that I asked of my professors when I said, how does all this visual information processing, which happens here in the visual cortex, how does all of this turn into an experience? Where is the subject of the mind receiving all of this information? The standard answer those days was, well, it's here. This is the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the cortex where sentient subjectivity arises, where you look back upon all of this information that's being processed in your visual and other cortices, and there it comes together in a global workspace, which is where the actual subject of the mind resides. Now, it so happens that I had a patient with absolutely no prefrontal cortex. Here he is. His name's patient W. Here's where his prefrontal lobes should be. As you can see, there's nothing of the kind. Here's another view of his brain. No prefrontal lobes whatsoever. Such cases are rare, but they do exist. So I took this opportunity, rare as it is, to ask him whether he exists as a sentient subject. And here's my interview with him. I asked him if he was consciously aware of his thoughts. He said, yes, of course he is. I asked him to perform a little experiment with me so that I could demonstrate that to my colleagues, because according to our understanding of how consciousness arises in the cortex, he shouldn't be able to be aware of his thoughts. So I asked him to picture in his mind, to imagine 2 dogs and 1 chicken. I then said to him to count the legs that he sees. How many legs are there in total if you see 2 dogs and 1 chicken? And he answered very disappointingly, 8. I said, 8? And he concluded, yes, the dogs ate the chicken. So that might not be the best joke in the world, but it certainly suggested to me that there was a sentient subject there. Even though he had no prefrontal cortex, he, patient W, as an experiencing subject, still existed. A few years after I qualified, a new theory took hold, a new theory as to where in the cortex the self resides. And that theory was enunciated by Bud Craig, and his conclusion was that the self arises in the insula. So here's a patient of my colleague Antonio Damasio's who had absolutely no insula, as you can see on the scan, absolutely obliterated. And Damasio interviewed him in much the same way as I interviewed my case, asked him, do you have a sense of self? Patient said, yes, I do, etc., etc. Eventually he says, Damasio says, what if I were to tell you that you are aware that I'm aware? The patient said, I would say, you're right. Damasio says, you're aware that I'm aware? The patient says, I'm aware that you're aware that I'm aware. So again, I hope that you will agree with me that this sort of evidence suggests, please note how many times the patient uses the word I. This sort of evidence suggests that even with total obliteration of the insula, just like with the prefrontal cortex, the sentient subject of the mind, the conscious being of the mind is still there. But in both of those cases, there's still lots of cortex left. What happens if you obliterate the cortex entirely? Well, there are children born with a condition known as hydranencephaly. I'm showing you a scan of one such girl, 3 years old, born with absolutely no cortex. Her brain stem is intact. There you see it. But she has absolutely no cortex. What happens to consciousness in such cases? Well, here she is. This is her. As you can see, she's awake. She's conscious in that sense. She wakes up in the morning. She goes to sleep at night. But notice the image on the right. When her baby brother is placed in her lap, she responds, and she responds emotionally, and she responds appropriately emotionally. She goes, ah, she likes it. She takes pleasure in the experience of her baby brother being placed on her lap. And so this to me was very striking evidence for the view that consciousness does not require a cerebral cortex. Here's another such child. Tell me she's not conscious. I draw your attention again, especially to the fact that these kids are emotionally responsive to their environments, and they show a full range of emotions. And here's just a slide. This chap, Bjorn Merker, studied these kids very intensively. I'm not going to read it all. The important bit is highlighted, all the feelings there. At the bottom here is that these responses are situationally appropriate. So these kids, emotionally responsive, they're emotionally responsive to their environments in appropriate ways. And this, as I've said, to me is compelling evidence that these kids are conscious. Remember, they have only a brain stem. And remember, I said earlier, perhaps we've been looking in the wrong place. If we've been looking to the cortex for the seat of consciousness, these kids who have absolutely no cortex clearly are conscious. By contrast to that, the enormous lesion that in these kids with absolutely no cortex, by contrast, if you damage the brain stem, the part that is preserved in those children, and you damage it in this area here, you need only 2 cubic millimeters of damage. In other words, the size of a match head. That's enough to obliterate consciousness. That region is called the parabrachial region. So compare that to cortex. Damage of the size of an ant in this part of the brain stem causes coma in every human being where there is damage in that region. So why aren't we looking to the brain stem to find the source of consciousness? The brain stem seems to be the most concentrated consciousness-producing tissue that there is. And I told you that the cortex can perform its functions unconsciously, and it does so unless it is activated by this region called the reticular activating system. It's the reticular activating system that renders the cortex conscious. Now, when we first discovered the reticular activating system is the source of consciousness, we were told it's like a power supply for a television set. Of course, the television set, in order to do its thing, has to be plugged in at the wall. But that doesn't mean that the electricity supply is really the actual stuff of television. It's just a necessary prerequisite. So against that background, this is why I thought it's so important to emphasize for you that these children with no cortex, they don't just have blank wakefulness. There's not just some kind of power supply powering nothing up. Their power supply has a quality and a content of its own. And that quality and content is what we call feeling. These kids feel emotions and affects. Affect is the technical term for feeling. But still, those kids have no cortex, so they can't tell us. We can't know for sure that they actually feel like anything at all. So in science, we rely on multiple lines of converging evidence using different methods. So let me give you a quick impressionistic tour through some of the other evidence for the view that I'm arguing in this book, that the source of consciousness, the hidden spring of the title of my book, is deep in the brain stem, in the reticular activating system and associated nuclei. So here's case 4. This is a patient who had Parkinson's disease, and for the treatment of Parkinson's disease, a deep brain electrode was put in here into the subthalamic nucleus. That's a standard treatment for Parkinson's disease. But the electrode went slightly too deep and went into the nucleus that's colored red on this slide. It's part of the reticular activating system, and it's called the substantia nigra. This patient had never suffered any psychiatric pathology in her life. But the minute within 5 seconds, in fact, of that nucleus being stimulated, she fell into a suicidal depression, something that she had never experienced before. Again, in the interests of time, I'm not going to read this to you, but no sooner was the electrode switched off than 90 seconds later, the depression stopped. The patient very kindly agreed to undergo then a further series of stimulations of that nuclei when she didn't know when it was on and when it was off. Every time it was on, she fell back into this profound depression. So here's evidence that you can actually generate emotion. You can actually stimulate and produce emotion by activating that part of the brain. Here's another method. So we've got lesion method, no cortex, you can still experience emotions. Brain stimulation of the brainstem suggests that the emotions are actually generated in the brainstem. Here, these are normal subjects in these various emotional states. And this is positron emission tomography showing where is the activation in the brain that generates sadness. It's in the brainstem. Anger, it's in the brainstem. Happiness, in the brainstem. Fear, in the brainstem. The cortex, please note, is not only not the source of the activation, it's actually positively deactivated. That's what these cool colors represent. Deactivation. The warm colors represent activation. The same applies to pharmacological probes. These are 3 brain chemicals that are produced by the cells that comprise the reticular activating system. Those are the source cells for the brain's serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, as you call it in the States. These are the brain chemicals that antipsychotics and antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs target. So the manipulation of the chemicals that are produced by this part of the brain doesn't lead just to anesthesia or its opposite. It entails the manipulation of emotions. This is why these chemicals are the standard targets of psychiatric drugs. Now, Sigmund Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, this thing that we rediscovered 100 years later, makes this interesting point, that although he made such a big thing about how much of the mind is unconscious, how much of cognition is unconscious, he points out that feelings, by definition, are conscious. It makes no sense to speak of a feeling that you can't feel. It's an oxymoron to speak of an unconscious feeling. But please note, this is not just a semantic point. As I've just showed you, the part of the brain that is the source of consciousness, the part of the brain whose essential function is the activation of the cortex to render it conscious, this part of the brain generates feelings. So feelings in some ways seem to be intimately bound up with the core business of consciousness. Let me go back to Chalmers. David Chalmers, the person who coined the hard problem, says here at the end of this quotation, there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. This is the same thing as I was telling you about Mary, the visual neuroscientist. Her knowledge of that cognitive function of vision wouldn't in any way prepare her for what it's like to experience vision. The function does not, explaining the function does not explain why there's something it is like to perform that function. But I think the crucial thing here is this word cognitive. If we were to change the word cognitive to affective, would Chalmers say this? There is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. I'm saying there is. If you explain the function of feeling, it will automatically explain why it feels like something, because the very purpose, the very functional role of feeling is to generate feelings. And so the essence of what I'm saying is we've been looking in the wrong place. We shouldn't look to cortex. We shouldn't look to cognition. We should look to the brain stem. We should look to affect if we're wanting to understand how the functional mechanism of consciousness gives rise to the experience of what it is like to be a mind. So what is the function of affect? The functional mechanism of affect is here. It's a very simple function. It's called homeostasis. Homeostasis works like this. Let me first of all point out homeostasis is the mechanism whereby we stay alive. It's what differentiates us living things from non-living things. Non-living things dissipate. It's called entropy. Entropy always increases in any natural process, but not in us living things. We resist entropy. In the end, entropy wins. We die, but for as long as we can, we fight it. And we fight it by means of this mechanism called homeostasis. And homeostasis is an automatic, unconscious function in regard to many bodily processes, like, for example, blood pressure regulation and so on. But what feeling does is it extends homeostasis in such a way that when you have a deviation from, say, your core body temperature or the water levels that you need or the glucose levels that you need or whatever to stay alive, if there's a deviation from that, you feel it. You feel it in the form of an unpleasant feeling. And what that unpleasant feeling tells you, the organism, is you're heading the wrong way. You're going to dissipate. Your entropy is increasing. This is bad. And what pleasurable feelings tell you is the opposite. Yep, you're doing the right thing. Carry on. That's it. Do that. Do that. That way you're going to survive because it heads you back towards your physiologically viable bounds. The green word on the screen, uncertainty, tells this story, that in an automatic homeostat, you have a built-in reflex, which just says, you know, if you're deviating from your core body temperature, then you perspire and you pant, and you head back toward your viable bounds. What feeling adds is that over and above that reflex, when you're in an uncertain situation, in other words, something which a reflexive response can't cope with, like you're in a hot kitchen and you're perspiring like hell, but still you're too hot. What you got to do is leave the kitchen, and that you have to move through the doorways and find where is the temperature lower, and it feels better when you enter the room that is cooler. Imagine a more alarming situation. It's a fire, a smoke-filled, carbon dioxide-filled room, and your viable oxygen bounds have been overshot. Now you need to decide, which way do I go? How do I escape? You've never been in a burning building before, let alone in this particular one. And feeling comes to your rescue. By feeling your way through the problem, you can make choices. You choose to go not where it feels more unpleasant, in other words, where your suffocation alarm increases, but rather where it feels more pleasant. In other words, where your suffocation alarm decreases. Your feeling tells you whether things are getting better or worse for you. That's what feeling adds. It adds the capacity for choice rooted in a value system, and that value system of that pleasurable feelings are good and unpleasurable feelings are bad is itself rooted in another value system, which is that it's good to survive and bad not to. This is the value system upon which all life depends. And what I'm saying is that voluntary action, choice, the ability to navigate uncertain situations, and heaven knows those are not rare in nature, that feeling enables us to do that. So that is the function of feeling. This is what it does. This is what it's for. So the fact that homeostasis, the lawful function of homeostasis, explains this function, leads us to enormous new vistas open up for the science of the mind. Because homeostasis can be reduced to laws, I and this colleague of mine, Carl Friston, we said, well, let's try and extend those laws, the laws of homeostasis, to explain how feelings arise. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to explain this equation to you. The crucial thing is this value here, which is in computational neuroscience, it's called precision. It's got to do with confidence in the current policy of the organism in relation to incoming error signals. This is basically a homeostatic mechanism, and it's feeling that regulates it all. If things are working out as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. And so all of this is unpacked obviously in much more detail in my book. So this life-preserving, evolutionarily conserved mechanism whereby organisms feel their own states in terms of how well or badly they're doing, in terms of their desire to remain alive. This mechanism can be reduced, like anything else in nature, to lawful mechanistic equations. And if there's time for us to go into this later, I would like to take up in the discussion, if this is true, if this really is the mechanistic explanation of how consciousness in its raw basic form of basic feelings, if this really is how feelings are generated causally, then we should be able to engineer this. It should be possible to engineer an artificial consciousness in this elementary form of a machine that knows its own states. And this is what we are currently working on. This is what I mean by this breakthrough opening up vast new terrain for the science of the mind. So that's the end of my summary of my book. Remember, it's about this question: why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? I'm saying once we understand the mechanism of feeling, then we understand why it can't go on in the dark. You can't have a feeling without feeling it. The very purpose of feeling is for the organism to know its own states subjectively and to act accordingly. Please remember, I've given you only the briefest impressionistic account. It's just a clue. If you want to have a fuller understanding of what this is all about, then you got to read the book. Thanks very much.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot. And you know what's amazing is he does lectures that are far longer and go into greater depth. Of course, that last chart, I really enjoyed your presentation when you actually get into that and what that means about how we predict and can see the uncertainties and are able to get around those. So hopefully we can get into some of that with the Q&A and people asking questions. Hit that like button if you guys are tuning in. Of course, share this content out. And if you have a question, of course, super chats are much appreciated. But we are going to take some questions as we go into this. And I had a few questions for you, Dr. Solms. I'm a recovering drug addict. I was on heroin for many years, but also alcohol. I thought, you know, it's socially acceptable. Everyone does it. I can drink like a normal individual. And something that was brought to my attention is how addiction hijacks the homeostasis process, and how the sense of pleasure gets hijacked in our consciousness. So can you just briefly on addiction give us your insight? Because this would be very useful for anyone who might want to try and understand what's going on. Of course, I've heard so many different ideas, but maybe from this point of view, the brain itself and what your research leads to the conclusion, the deep brainstem is where this stuff, the serotonin and the epinephrine, not epinephrine.
That's it.
Yeah. So where all this stuff's taking place, what's going on, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so these chemicals, they're called neuromodulators as opposed to neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the message passers from synapse to synapse, and that's what most people think, that's what goes on between neurons. But there's a second process which is called neuromodulation, which is the modulating of the arousing and de-arousing of those message passing pathways. Now, remember, I told you it's not just a power supply. It's not some quantitative dimension of more or less volume. Mm-hmm. Each of these modulators has a quality of its own. And so they modulate the message passing through feeling. So feeling and cognition are necessary bedfellows. Now, you asked about addiction and the substances that you mentioned. They act on those neuromodulators. Bear in mind what they do. They create pleasurable feelings and unpleasurable feelings. What those feelings mean is that what you are doing cognitively is working or is not working. In other words, pleasurable feelings say, yes, you're doing the right thing, do more of that. Unpleasant feelings say, no, that's not working, don't do that. So it has everything to do with what you're actually doing in the world to meet the needs that underlie those feelings. And so here's an important point that I need to add, that we don't just have a thing called feeling, we have multiple feelings. Each one of them is qualitatively distinct. And that's because we need to know, what do I need? If you're sleepy, going and eating a hamburger is not going to help. And if you're thirsty, then moving to a cooler environment is not going to help. You need to do something specific to meet each one of those needs. So here's a crucial point. Feelings mean something. If I'm feeling hungry, it means I need to eat. If I'm feeling thirsty, it means I need to drink. And emotional feelings work in the same way. If I am fearful, I need to escape the danger. If I have a feeling of panicky separation distress, I need to find my attachment figure that I've become separated from. If I feel rageful, it means I've got to get rid of this obstacle that's in my way, and so on. So emotional feelings, just like bodily feelings, they work in exactly the same homeostatic way. Remember, the feeling tells you whether what you are doing is working or not. Now, you mentioned, what did you say? You said alcohol, and did you say cocaine?
No, heroin.
Heroin. Okay, so heroin is an artificial opiate. So in our brains, we have endorphins, which is one of these modulators that I'm talking about. Beta endorphins acting on mu opioid receptors. When you have that feeling, when you have that chemical, that neuromodulator increasing, it means what you are doing in terms of trying to establish connection with attachment figures is working. It means, yes, carry on doing that. It works. It means you are loved, you're cared for, you're safe, you're connected, etc. If you just take the drug, heroin, it falsely gives you the impression that you are warm, loved, fuzzy, you're not alone. You're part of a community, etc. But of course, it's actually not true. It's artificially generating that feeling. So that's what you were told about how they hijack these homeostatic systems. That, remember with the diagram I showed you of the homeostat, the blue line, you're heading back to where you need to be. That blue line means what you are doing at the moment is working.
Right.
But if you officially create that blue line, that pleasurable feeling, just by taking a drug, you've hijacked the system because you haven't actually done the work that's necessary to really meet the underlying need. So you have the illusion of being attached, connected, loved, cared for, thought about, etc., when in fact you're not. And if you relate that to the underlying biology of it, the reason why we mammals need to attach is because we can't look after ourselves. We're social animals, and especially in infancy, we suckle. We can't even feed ourselves. So to delude yourself that you've met that need is just that. It's deluding yourself. And in the end, it ends in tears. But it's also because by artificially imbibing these chemicals, you change the settling point. Your body thinks, I don't need to produce this chemical because I'm getting it anyway for nothing. And so the settling point in terms of your production of those endorphins, and the same applies to dopamine in the case of people who take drugs like amphetamine and cocaine and so on, which is another kind of need. It's not the same as the attachment need I'm talking about. That's how these systems get hijacked. One last comment on this, Derek. My answer's probably been too long. Is what the person is addicted to tells you something about the psychology of that person also, because it shows you which emotional need is not being met. People who I mean, I don't want to probe into your personal life.
I don't care. You're more than welcome to.
Maybe it rings a bell for you when I say, that people who take opiates, it's got to do with separation and loss. The pain of social isolation and separation, loss, despair, those sorts of feelings. That's what opiates are good for. They take away the pain of social aloneness. Whereas, drugs like amphetamine and cocaine, they boost your confidence, and they make you feel sexy and and energize you. It's a very different kind of pleasure, meeting a different kind of emotional need. So,
yeah. Okay, we got some questions. I'm going to try and chip away at these. Good friend of mine, Joel Pearson, he says, maybe the real question isn't why does it feel like something to have a survival imperative? It's how could you have a survival imperative without feeling like something? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I actually briefly touched on this point in my supercharged presentation, so I'm not surprised that I didn't actually get the point across. It's not really true that every survival function is felt. There are many survival functions, even in the human body, which is such a complicated organism. I mentioned briefly blood pressure regulation. Your blood pressure is being regulated all the time, homeostatically. But you're not aware of it at all. You don't feel your blood pressure overshoots and undershoots until it's too late, when you lose consciousness or you burst a blood vessel. Then you feel it. But the business of how am I doing in terms of my homeostatic set point in relation to blood pressure regulation, it goes on without awareness. And there are many other such things in the body that go on without awareness all the time. These are what we call vegetative functions or autonomic functions. And autonomic is probably the best word for it, that they function automatically. You don't need to be there. Let me mention, as I did in my brief talk, respiratory control. That's a very good example. We're not normally aware of our need to breathe. We don't feel, shit, I need oxygen, shit, I need oxygen, shit, I need oxygen. It just happens. You're breathing automatically until you don't have oxygen. Like my example of being in a carbon dioxide filled room, then suddenly you feel consciously the need to breathe. And that's where feeling kicks in. So something which was automatic now becomes voluntary because you now need to make choices. So survival functions with like blood pressure, it's not complicated, it's like dilate the vessel, constrict the vessel, increase the heartbeat, decrease the heartbeat. Those are the only two things you can do. But when it comes to being in a room that's full of carbon dioxide and you don't know, should I go this way, should I go that way, should I go up, should I go down? I've never been in this situation before. You feel your way through it. And the feelings tell you how you're doing, whether you're making good choices or bad. So that's it's not that every survival function needs feeling. It's the additional bonus survival function where you can survive in uncertain, unknown, unpredicted situations, and that's an added something more than mere homeostasis. It's feeling your homeostasis.
Dr. Solms, we got a super chat here, and I jumped to super chats, but I want to get back up to other questions if we don't get super chats. If you get super chats, I'm going to jump on you first. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the 5. Einstein was a determinist. Does the issue of free will still exist or not still a debate in the 21st century? Does your study on consciousness have any bearing on this particular question when it comes to this? Because I heard you, and I just got to mention this because I've been watching you for a while now. You mentioned I can't remember what avenue, if you will, or where in science that they're able to see that the thought takes place. I can't remember how many milliseconds prior to the action even happening. And do we really have the control over such? Is determinism free will? How's that work in your mind?
Okay, so I think the question that was posed there about free will is not quite the same take on it as the thing you're referring to. So I'll mention both of them. I'll start with the question about determinism. So yes, I do believe in free will, but I don't think that it's an absolute function. I think it's a probabilistic one. So determinism includes probabilistic determination, and that is sort of the transition from classical physics to quantum physics has everything to do with probability theory. So we mustn't think of causality in purely linear, A leads to B leads to C terms. It's that A increases the chances of B and decreases the chances of C, That's the kind of determinism I believe in. So to bring that to concretely link up with our subject matter, you could say, the story in the Bible of Daniel and the lion's den. Daniel chose of his own free will to enter the lion's den. So you can, of your own free will, do things like enter the lion's den, but the chances of you doing that are not very big. Okay, so your probability of you entering a lion's den, if I were to say, here's 100 people, there's a lion in a den, how many of them are going to enter that den? Maybe 1 in 100, maybe 0 in 100. So that's a probabilistic, and you see it's got to do with fear. It's got to do with the feeling, lion, I'm avoiding that. You can override that feeling, that's free will. But the chances of you doing it are slim. Why? Because fear predicts your demise. The chances are, if you enter a lion's den, you're going to cop it. You're going to be dead. So you don't override feelings lightly. So that's my take on the free will problem, is that there is a mechanism in the brain for free will. It can be accounted for mechanistically using probabilistic equations. And I hope that you can see from what I've just said that probability theory, when it comes to the homeostasis, has everything to do with feelings. Feelings, when you find yourself in a highly improbable state, it's bad for you. Like us human beings, it's very unlikely that we will find ourselves 200 feet below the surface of the water, because we can't survive there. But you can, but good luck to you. As to your question about what level in the brain, so what you're referring to is the work by Benjamin Libet, Libet, who showed that if he asked research subjects to move their finger by free will at any point in time, they could just choose to move, and then they had to register on a huge clock measured in milliseconds at what moment within the second, at what millisecond did they make the conscious choice, I'm going to move my finger. And what Libet showed is that a good half second before that, about 400 milliseconds before they consciously decide to move their fingers, the motor cortex, or that's called the premotor cortex, there's a particular type of waveform which we call the readiness potential. It's an electrical measure of what's going on in that part of the cortex. And when you're busy starting to move, before you actually move, this readiness potential shows you're gearing up to move. And what Libet showed is half a second before you decide I'm going to move, your brain is already cranking up to do the move, which shows you unconsciously decided to move before you consciously decide to move. Now, that's supposed to disprove free will. And my take on that experiment is that, again, it's got to do with the difference between the cortex and the brainstem. The initial, the affective impetus, the raw process that initiates a movement precedes the cognitive, reflective thought, I've decided to move. So the difference is not between free will and the lack of it, but rather between the actual source of our consciousness, which, as I'm saying, is in the brain stem, in these affect-generating structures, and the cognitive representation of our consciousness, which is a second-order re-representation of the initiated process. So I think what we're measuring there is the delay between the raw impulse and the cognitive reflection upon it.
Thank you, Dr. Solms. Theoretically, thank you for the question. MythVision Podcast, I would like to ask about conscious pain and pleasure directing also single cell organisms like Pharmacia, I think, or Amobia, who have no brain stem.
Yes. Well, not only do they have no brain stem, they have no brain. They have no nervous system. So this is a very important and troubling question. At what level of complexity in the animal series do we I mean, when I say animal series, when you talk about an amoeba, you're not really talking about an animal, I suppose. But, does a single cell bacterium, it's alive, it's homeostatically regulated. Does that mean it's conscious? What about, plants? What about insects? What about worms, etc.? Until eventually you get to mice and rats and, and so on. So the answer to that question is we have to start with humans. We have to start with ourselves, because we are the only creatures who can verbally declare, I am conscious. And in fact, even that is indirect evidence, because it's only your own consciousness that you can directly observe. So we know that humans, at least that we ourselves as examples of humans, you, Derek, and I, Mark, we each know we are conscious. And then using the kinds of evidence that I've just summarized for you half an hour ago, we know where in the brain this consciousness is coming from. On my view, it's coming from the reticular activating system of the brainstem. And I showed you when you stimulate that, you can actually generate very particular feelings. Now I can look to any other animal that has a reticular activating system, and there's also another structure there called the periaqueductal gray. I know what happens if you stimulate those structures in me, so I can thereby predict that if I stimulate the same structure in the other creature that has the same anatomy, it will lead to a behavior consistent with it having a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling. And so lots of experiments of that kind have been done. And on the basis of that sort of experiment, we've concluded, when I say we, there's not consensus on this, but, I would like to say reasonably minded scientists have concluded that every creature with a reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, all the evidence suggests that they're conscious. What does that mean? It means all vertebrates. Okay, all vertebrates, which evolved 550 million years ago. What is a vertebrate? It's an animal with a spinal column. That means, for example, a fish. Even a fish, and why do we say that? Because of the sort of evidence that I was. You stimulate that structure in a fish, you can predict it's going to avoid the stimulus or it's going to be attracted to the stimulus. And you mentioned addiction earlier. You might be amused to hear that fish like cocaine, they like morphine, they like nicotine, and they like amphetamines. None of those drugs, as you know, is good for you. They don't do you any good in terms of your underlying survival function. They hijack, as we were discussing earlier. What do they hijack? They hijack the feelings. So the only thing that's appealing about morphine is that it feels good. It doesn't do you any good. So these fish, they're swimming around in a tank. At this end, you put food, and they prefer to be at that end because there's food there. But then at the other end, you place cocaine or morphine, and then what ends up happening is that the fish hang out there where the drugs are and then briefly dart back for food. So that's we call conditioned place preference behavior. So that's the kind of evidence we use to show that all vertebrates are conscious. Once you go beyond vertebrates to creatures without an upper brain stem, creatures without a brain, creatures whose nervous systems are very differently organized from ours, and creatures without a nervous system, such as the ones that are being asked about on the screen, it becomes increasingly impossible to tell just by this kind of homolog anatomy and function that I was talking about. But the functional part is still what we can hang our hats on. I told you that the mechanism, what this mechanism of feeling is for, is to enable the animal to make voluntary decisions, to make choices in unpredicted situations. So we can say that a creature that is conscious is capable of doing that, and a creature that is not conscious will always and only operate by reflex. It will have automatized, stereotyped, entirely predictable responses, and that's certainly at the level of an amoeba. They are entirely predictable in terms of how they're going to respond to any stimulus. So I'll conclude by saying this. I'm confident that, and all the evidence is consistent with the conclusion that every vertebrate is conscious. I'm very unconfident that single-celled organisms are conscious, or any other organisms that show no capacity for voluntary behavior and choice. Then there's a gray area in between. And like everything else in biology, there's no sharp dividing line. I mean, for example, I would be very reluctant to say that an octopus isn't conscious. An octopus shows an incredible capacity for choice, voluntary decisions, and the like. So even though their nervous system is so different from ours, I'm more than willing to give the benefit of the doubt to an octopus.
That is well said. And he says, thank you, Dr. Solms. Derek, answer my questions. You made my day with this stream. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to just mention, I think it's interesting looking at this scientifically, the way that you and others have researched this stuff. It's easier when we have so much more to grapple with. We can compare ourselves to other species. It's a real quick way to see, okay, there's similar things here, function similar. But when I was, I watched this YouTube video a while back on the development of, or the evolution of consciousness. And it goes back to like these no-brain species, if you will, that are surviving. And it's about food, energy. It's all just kind of, when you say consciousness, should we even use that term? Because if what you mean by that, that's awareness and feeling, as I wrote down multiple times, experience, awareness, feeling, things like that. These creatures obviously are living, but are they really conscious? Are they feeling? Maybe, but in what way? How would we, how could we put that down? And so I don't know if you want to just comment on that real quick or not. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the first thing to say or to concede or admit is the limits of scientific knowledge. There are things that we can say with a high degree of confidence, and there are things that we can say with very little confidence. And I think that this question of what creature is and isn't conscious, it's one of those. There's no. But my view is based on the kinds of reasoning and evidence that I've just been adducing, is that there's a continuum. There's not a moment where suddenly the creature is conscious in a way that you and I will recognize as being anything like our consciousness. But when you take my point about feeling being the elemental foundational form of consciousness, try and imagine what the dawn of consciousness was like. It's a creature registering something like its own energy supply, dwindling energy supply. This is a crisis for the creature. It simply is objectively an existential crisis for the creature. Getting too hot, eventually you're going to expire. So feeling too hotness, this is what we mustn't think about it being anything like what you and I mean, what you and I are doing now is the most complicated form of consciousness that exists. That's not the place to begin your search to understand, what it is and where to look for it. But if you're talking about just those simple kinds of things, we can go quite a way down in terms of the complexity of the creatures that we're talking about. However, in that continuum, there comes a point where what you have is let's say, something which like a proto-intentional. It's got all the basics that can become or that will become. And for me, the crucial transition has to do with the number of needs that the organism has. If you just have one or two or three needs, you can have a very simple algorithm, which is eat, sleep, drink, eat, sleep, drink, eat, sleep, drink, sleep every 24 hours, eat every 12 hours, drink every 6 hours. And think about how much processing power is necessary for that. There's no need for choices. There's no need for any of the kind of stuff that I was saying. Feeling adds to homeostasis. Feeling your way through an entirely unpredictable situation it requires much more complexity in terms of processing power. And crucially, this point, Derek, that each one of those different needs, remember I said it has to do with how many we have. Each one of them, as I told you, has to be met in a particular way. Eating does not satisfy your need to sleep. Defecating does not satisfy your need to drink, and so on. So there's a very different thing you need to do in relation to each one of those needs. So that's why they're, as it were, color-coded or flavored, so that you know which thing you're feeling. But even before feelings evolve, as long as you always have to do the same thing, there's no need for you to be aware which one's being prioritized. It could just be in terms of the numbers. But once there's no pre-programmed automatic response pattern, it's context dependent. Now I'm prioritizing this, now I'm prioritizing that. Then you need to know, well, what is my need at the moment? What is it 5 seconds later? This is where the conscious feeling of the need starts to come into its own. I hope that in those few sentences I've been able to get across the main point, to where that transition happens and what it's for, and why it has to do with the multiplicity of needs and the unpredictability of how to meet them in changing contexts. It's at that point that it starts to become a sort of an engineering necessity, that the system is able to register its own state in some qualitative form.
If you don't mind taking just the time to, because my channel, I delve into various things. A lot of times I help harmed cult members who are escaping a harmful, high control cult environment. Then I study mythology. I get into all sorts of stuff here on this channel. And one of the questions we talk about is God, but not going into the God topic, so to speak, but philosophy. And I'd like to ask you this because I know some people who are philosophical naturalists. I know some people who are non-dualist, and they want to say consciousness, and the way they define what it is different than the way that you're kind of explaining it here. Well, they might agree with everything you say, but then they go, well, it's something out there and it's a different thing. I don't know if you're comfortable going into this discussion on that particular topic because your field is science. And I know you like to stick to concrete facts as much as possible as you observe these things. So some of this might be your opinion. However, I'm just interested to find out, in the vein of this research, if this helps us get any closer to solving that problem and saying, look, it doesn't require some outside source necessarily. Evolutionary processes can lead us into the conclusion of consciousness. It doesn't require necessarily some metaphysical or a panpsychism type position to explain the details. Could you give us your opinion, even if that is something you can elaborate on?
Yeah, I'm very happy to give you my opinion. When you say if that's something you're comfortable with, of course I am. So I'd like to say two things in answer to that question. Bear in mind, I'm going to say two things, because when I speak now, it's only the first thing that I'm going to say. I don't want your viewers to think that this is my answer. It's the first part of my answer. The first part of my answer starts with the observation that all the evidence suggests that consciousness is not something that just floats about, that was there forever. The evidence suggests that it evolved, that there was a dawn of consciousness, and I've already told you what the mechanisms are which give rise to consciousness, and we've spoken about what level of complexity of creature does this sort of mechanism appear in. It certainly appears in vertebrates. It becomes less clear in simpler creatures, and it's bloody obvious. There's no consciousness in an amoeba, for the reasons that I was describing earlier. The anatomy doesn't exist, the functionality doesn't exist, the behavior doesn't exist. So the evidence suggests there's no consciousness there. Now, bearing in mind that those first unicellular organisms, that they're the first living things on the planet, you must remember that prior to the evolution of life, there was the planet, and the universe existed for a hell of a long time before life evolved. So, from the Big Bang to the emergence of life on Earth is eons and eons of time. Then from the emergence of life on Earth till the emergence of consciousness in that life is again, we're talking about a hell of a lot of years. And if you accept that's the evidence suggests that that mechanism is what's necessary to generate consciousness, and you accept that that mechanism evolved, then you have to accept that it must have evolved out of something non-conscious. That the raw ingredients had to be there, which had to be assembled in a certain way, which then gave rise to consciousness. That's the first part of my answer. I'm saying the evidence suggests that consciousness is a relatively recent thing in the universe. I would say it's at least 550 million years old, but compare that to the age of the universe and you see what I'm talking about. Now, here's the second part of my answer, Derek. There are things in heaven and earth about which we have no evidence, and can have no evidence. So science is about evidence, by which I mean we have to make testable predictions and falsifiable predictions. Then we do the experiment and we say, does my prediction it come to pass or does it not? So you can't make falsifiable predictions about things like there is life after death. You have to die first, and then go to wherever you go, and then come back again and say, yep, I've tested the prediction. This is what happens. It never happens. It can't happen. So what I'm saying is that we scientists need to show some humility when it comes to the limits of what we can speak about. It doesn't. So I am not. You might be surprised to hear this. I'm not an atheist.
Right. I kind of figured that a little bit, but yeah.
But nor am I a believer. I'm agnostic. I'm just saying about that. I don't know. I really don't know. I follow the evidence, and I come to the conclusions that I can where there is evidence to be gathered. Where there isn't evidence to be gathered, I just have to admit my ignorance, and I find some sort of comfort in that. We mustn't overrate ourselves.
I appreciate that. No, I think everyone watching that isn't upset about some of the evolution stuff, because there are people who probably don't even believe in evolution, which is sad. I mean, we're trying to move forward and learn based off this information, but I really appreciate that, because I hear a lot of people arguing very strange philosophical arguments with the word consciousness. And when you're talking, it's so tangible what you're saying. It's not woo-woo. I always use that term. It's like woo-woo when it means, when you're fluffing up words to mean all this stuff, and then when they stop talking, you kind of forget what they're saying. Like, what the hell were they saying again? So what you said is powerful. I really appreciate that. Somebody who's in the chat now, Shannon Q, she has a YouTube channel. She actually inspired me to want to contact you. Like, she knows the brain stuff far greater than I would. And I know that the engagement between you and her on a show, I'm saying this publicly, I would hope that you and her connect, because she's fascinated with your work. Too bad in Canada, or where she's located, she can't get your book right now. They just, not on Audible at least, because she's trying to listen to your book. But I say that to say thank you, Shannon Q, for giving me the interest, because I think this is relevant. Yes, we're going to meet our limits, but with testable, observable things, I'm not going to say there couldn't be something beyond, but in all the books that I read, all the stories, I like to call them myths, and that can be defined in different ways. I kind of see how that falls apart, in my opinion. So based on the tangible, what you do, it gives me excitement to learn more about the brain and understanding of the brain, because a lot of people want to say, well, consciousness is driving in the brain is the vehicle, but consciousness is this thing that comes down and is in it. And when that part gets damaged, it limits what consciousness can do, because it's some spirit or soul or immaterial thing. Would you comment on the spirit, soul, immaterial thing, and maybe like how that has nothing to do with the reality of what you guys are testing?
Well, as I said, all I can do is go with the evidence. That and when I said that there are some questions about which we can gather no evidence, like questions about life after death, is there a God, and so on. You just can't. There's no way that you can prove or disprove, your beliefs on those questions. That doesn't mean that everything is relative. I'm saying that there are things about which there is no evidence, and can be no evidence, and there we just have to accept the limits of science and have some humility about it. But that doesn't mean that within that which we can gather evidence, that we can just have any old opinion we like. So, science is not omniscient, but it's pretty much the best thing we've got. It's like testing your beliefs against reality. The alternative to that is craziness. That's what, when I say testing your beliefs against reality, I deal with mental illness all the time. I know what it looks like when you believe things which just aren't there. This is not good news. So when I say that science has its limits, I am not saying that within those limits, where we can test our hypotheses, that we are absolved of the responsibility to do so. We have to, if we're going to make claims which are within the realm of evidence-based science, then we've got to subject those claims to rigorous experiment, and we've got to accept the results. You've got to say, hey, I predict the following will happen. And if it doesn't happen, sorry, mate, your theory is out the window. And the results of others where their predictions are supported by the evidence.
This leads me to an important distinction, and I guess it's an important distinction in the current debate with those who are in neuroscience. I watched a debate with you and Christina Maria, I think her name is Dr. Maria, and others and stuff, and you said a very interesting point. You're like, look, we can only do what the evidence points us to. And it seems like neuroscientists are trying to say your field is subjective to the point where it's not testable, double placebo effect. Like you're not really able to prove what you're saying. And it's all like, let me speak to the patient, let the patient's subjective experience tell me what they're doing. And you do a really good job of how memories get conflated or mixed up in trials with certain people who have brain surgery. I found that fascinating. Could you maybe talk about that quote? Because this goes into that quote at the beginning where you said neuropsychology is honorable. Why is what you do important, and how is it distinguished from neuroscience, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So the colleague you're talking about is Christina Alberini. And she's at NYU, and she does really brilliant work on memory, in particular on something called reconsolidation, which is how we update our memories. I don't remember the exact conversation that you're referring to, but I do know the principle that you're referring to. So I can well imagine that she and I had a bit of an argument about it. So let me take you a little bit back into the history of my field. This time last century, the behaviorism was the order of the day. And what the behaviorists said was that if you can't see it, then it doesn't exist. It doesn't count as evidence. And what that means when it comes to the science of the mind, which is the being of the organism, in other words, the subjective perspective upon the organism, that's what the mind is. Remember, I said to you earlier, you and I can only observe our own minds, but it's because the mind is something subjective. It's not an object. It's the subjective perspective on the organism. So if you're going to exclude subjective data from the science of the mind, as far as I can tell, you've excluded the mind from the science of the mind. And that's quite a high price to pay. But I can understand where the behaviorists were coming from, because they were saying, well, we're empiricists. You have to be able to observe things. So they said only behavior counts. We don't want to know what lies behind it, inside the black box, as they called it those days. But now, that was 100 years ago. Now we have powerful tools whereby we can look objectively into the black box. I showed you in my little talk, PET imaging, positron emission tomography. And there are even more wonderful things, like optogenetics, where you can actually see an individual string of neurons lighting up, when a particular memory is activated. And you can activate that memory by optogenetically activating those neurons. We have incredible. I'm just mentioning two methods there at random: the deep brain stimulation I showed you, fMRI, transcranial magnetic stimulation, blah, 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 blah. We can just see what's going on there and manipulate what's going on in the brain with incredible degree of reliability and precision. Now, once you've got those kinds of tools, then the subjective side of the equation is no longer untethered, where you can just sort of say anything. You're saying, okay, well, let me stimulate this part of the brain. The patient says, I feel like shit. I want to die, as you saw, in the slide I showed you from Bromstadt's experiment. If you do the same thing with another patient and she says the same thing, and then you do the same thing with another patient and he says the same thing, eventually you got to say, why would 5 patients all lie to me that they feel depressed when I stimulate that nucleus? So that subjective data now counts as pretty reliable evidence because it's tied to an objective manipulation. And that's the very basis of everything that I've done in the last 35 years of my scientific career. When I took that weird step of training in psychoanalysis, I said, I want to learn about all these subjective methods, everything that all the terms and concepts and theories they've derived from from studying human minds subjectively. And then I want to test it using objective methods, the two together. It's not reducing subjectivity to objectivity, to mind to matter or matter to mind. It's sort of like supplements. It sort of extends both disciplines. And it enables them to correct viewpoint dependent errors, because this is not a small point, Derek. There are things that you can never see with your eyes that exist, like a feeling. The only way you're ever going to be able to observe a feeling is through subjective data. And if we're going to rule subjective data out of court, we are never going to understand how the brain works, because surely the brain feels like something unlike any other organ for a reason. The feelings must be doing something. And if you're not going to take account of those, you're never going to understand how this part of nature works.
Wow.
I'm scared of subjective data unless it is unfettered. As long as it's tied to objective data, then we've enriched science.
Interesting. I want to say hit that like button, everybody. Shannon Q. Oh, thanks. So sweet. Thanks. I want to ask him about cognition and if it occurs above the level of conscious experience.
I'm not sure well, first of all, Shannon Q, thank you for introducing me to Derek. I'm very glad that you brought me to his attention, because we're having a great conversation. I'm not sure what you mean by cognition rising above experience. Maybe I should put my specs on so I can read that question.
Yeah, I want to ask him about cognition and if
above it occurs, the level. Yeah.
So I'll wait for her to respond if she,
Yeah. Well, while you're busy thinking about responding, I just use a different. I would use a different sort of metaphor. For me, cognition is not above experience. Unless you're meaning feeling, perhaps that's what you mean. I do look on it like that. I think I get it now. So, you have feelings about, I feel like this, and if you're a little zebrafish, it's all you have is like, I like this, I don't like this, but you don't know what this is. It's just a feeling. So your behavior is just being, regulated by what it feels like. Then to be able to extend the feeling onto a cortical representation that you can hold in mind. I feel like this about that. That's a whole additional step to be able to think what it is that your feelings are about. So that's how I look on it, that we feel our way into our cognitions, which are otherwise unconscious. So why do we feel our way into our cognitions? It's whenever we're uncertain, because cognitions are just automatic algorithms. This is why cognition is for the most part unconscious. But whenever the algorithm doesn't lead to the outcome that's predicted, then you're in a state of uncertainty. Then you've got to update the algorithm. Then you need to feel your way through the problem. And so, this is why cognition is constantly being rendered conscious once more. But let us not forget that at any point in time, the vast bulk of your cognitive processing is unconscious. There's a tiny fraction of it that's conscious at any point in time. As no doubt many of your viewers already know, short-term memory, the conscious part of our cognition, you can only hold about 7 bits of information in the air in consciousness at any one point in time. So compare how much information processing goes on in your brain, billions and billions of bits of information, and only 7 bits of them are conscious at any one moment in time. It gives you a sense of what a pinprick of light consciousness casts upon your cognitions.
She says, yes, he's getting me. How does cognition integrate with conscious experience if emotion is first order consciousness in the brainstem, etc.? So yeah, I think you touched on that.
Yes.
I have to ask this because I wrote this. Why are we aware is one of the things, and what is awareness, right? But you've kind of explained all of this like multiple times throughout this thing. But in that whole, there's only 7 bits of information that we hold as conscious. You mentioned, I think in some of your lectures, but also in your book, where you said, we haven't been able to really know what it's for. Like what purpose does awareness, conscious awareness really serve? Because without it, we still go on and on. I might mate to reproduce. I might eat because I got to eat. I got a bowel movement. I got to go. It's getting hot. Let me get out of the room. All of that can be done without necessarily awareness. But what does awareness or consciousness serve? And what purpose does it serve? Can you say what that purpose in your view serves and why?
Yeah. Well, a lot depends on what you mean by the word awareness, and I'm not being clever here. It really leads to a lot of confusion in my field that different people mean different things by awareness. So let me just very quickly tell you how I think that there are 3 different levels to that word. The first is raw feeling. Okay, it's just feeling the sorts of things you were just talking about, feeling too hot, feeling the need to go to the loo, that's just a feeling. And so, for example, pain, it's just a feeling, you don't need to, or you just feel pain and you withdraw. Then the second level is that's affective consciousness. Then we get into cognitive consciousness, where you have representations, images. So the feeling attaches to, so the feeling of pain can happen just by itself. Then it's a matter of, oh, the pain, there's a pin on my right finger, pushing into my right finger. That's the thing. And you see, this is what the feeling is about. So that's cognitive awareness as opposed to affective awareness. And it's already a much higher level because you can hold that thing in mind. You can not only hold it in mind while you do something about it. It's like, okay, there's the thing I'm going to do. But also you can bring it back to mind. You can imagine the future through images, cognitive images. You can feel your way through future situations. So that saves lives. You can try it out in virtual reality before doing it in reality. And that leads to the third level, which is the reflective consciousness. It's in being able to reflect back upon your own cognitions, knowing what you know and knowing what you feel. And that's the sort of a higher level of abstraction where all sorts of other things go on, like somebody mentioned Einstein. You can't imagine Einstein's work if it's just a kind of concrete, I feel like this about that. It has to be like, okay, well, let me reflect back on all of this. So, over those different levels, we're talking about very different things. Most people, when they speak of awareness, seem to mean the third level. In other words, reflecting upon your own cognitions and feelings. But for all the reasons I've said now repeatedly during this program, for me, I prefer to start at the other end, because I know we're right at the end of our time. So let me give you this punchline, because all the other levels of awareness are contingent upon feeling. If you take out the feeling, all of the rest of it disappears, and the opposite does not apply.
Dr. Solms, I got to ask this last little, squeeze us in. Dr. Solms, how do you consider the benefits of SSRI or SDRI?
Well, it depends what you're taking them for. So I don't think that SSRIs are far from redundant. It's a matter of what, the problem with SSRIs is that it used to be kind of like, whatever is the matter with you, take an SSRI. It's good for depression. It's good for panic disorder. It's good for OCD. It's good for common unhappiness. So precisely because that's not a good approach, we need to have more precise tools. So all of this drug development, it's not like that's better than the old. In all the old antidepressants, for example, the tricyclics, and the oxidase inhibitors and so on, we still use them, but it depends. It depends what it is you're trying to hammer on the head.
Thank you for that answer. Gary Stone's a really good friend of mine, and I really appreciate that. Mitch, you're trying to hold us on. We got to let Dr. Solms go. Here's the last question. Please ask Dr. Solms where he thinks the most important research is currently in his field.
Well, I may surprise and perhaps even disappoint some of you when I say I think it's in artificial consciousness. That is the Richard Feynman, the brilliant physicist, when he died, written on his blackboard. I'm not saying these were his last words. I mean, I don't know when he wrote it on his blackboard, but after he died, it was found on his blackboard. He wrote, "If I can't create it, I don't understand it." And I really think that that's true. So, the artificial consciousness is, for me, the final testing ground of any theory of consciousness. If we accept, as seems to be generally accepted, that the number one problem of science is consciousness, as my opening slide suggested, this is why it's called the hard problem, then if the ultimate testing ground of any theory which claims to have explained how consciousness works, if you understand how consciousness works, okay, then engineer it. If you can't engineer it, you haven't explained how it works. And that's why I think that's the most exciting area of research in my field.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solms. I'm sorry to keep you just that extra few minutes there. And thank you for the super chat. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine if we could create a artificial consciousness that we are able to experiment and know, hey, we can play God, so to speak, here. And I think it would be a fascinating thing to discover. I really appreciate you coming on. I hope that I can do more with you and do more shows where we could discuss this. At one point, we had 400 and something people watching at one point during this broadcast, which was really, really cool. I'd like to read more of your works, delve deeper into the topic so I'm not completely an ignorant person on this, and actually be able to engage in the discussion and learn more from you. So I really appreciate you and all of the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoy talking about these things, as you can imagine. In fact, I don't know why anybody talks about anything else.
I would hope you'd say that, especially since this is serious in your life. And we didn't even talk about your brother, but maybe one day we'll get to discuss one of the motivating factors underneath your entire drive for consciousness and the brain, of course, with your own brother. So thank you so much, Dr. Solms. Ladies and gentlemen,
thank you.
Hit that like button. Go get his book right now. If you can't get it because your country doesn't allow it on Audible, get the paperback. It's really worth it. And I want to do more with Dr. Solms. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you missed the live, I'm so sorry for you. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Here we go.